All right, I think we are live, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, and thank you all so much for being with us today. My name is Gabor Jupan, and I'm coming to you live from the beautiful Explore More Me lab in Discovery Place Science. Just to be sure, I want to make sure I address this off the jump. We are wearing masks everywhere in the building, with the exception when someone is in a room by themselves, and I am in a room by myself, so I have removed my mask so you can see my face. But we are indeed wearing masks throughout the building. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and begin. So those of us who love animals and love the richness of our world as the blue planet with an amazing diversity of life can't help but pause during this extraordinary time and consider how our cohabitants are faring with all that is happening, from quarantines to climate change and the general impact of the human population. Today, we have the incredible privilege of having with us Dr. Scott Weir, an assistant professor from Queen's University in Charlotte. Dr. Weir's research and teaching focuses on ecological relationships between animals, including humans, and the rest of the ecosystems in which they exist. Dr. Weir, thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to talk to everybody about what I do and about some of the work that I've been doing with students. I'll say at the start, to those watching and to Gabor as well, you can feel free to refer to me as Scott. I make a big point of it in class to tell students that, they don't have to be very formal with me. They don't have to think about me as being something special or something that requires a lot of formality just because I'm a scientist. I very strongly believe that anybody listening at home could become a scientist if they wanted to pursue that and put in the effort. And so there's nothing special about me that that requires a certain amount of formality. So feel free to call me Dr. Weir or Scott or whatever makes you the most comfortable, especially if you want to ask a question during all this.
Well, I do appreciate your generosity. To call you Dr. Weir would reflect the well-deserved respect that you're owed for your many years of hard work to earn a doctorate and then all the work you do beyond. I do appreciate that, though. It's similar to the mission of Discovery Place. You aspire to make science open and accessible to anyone. So I will take you up on your generous offer and call you Scott today. For those of you joining us on Facebook Live, welcome. We're glad that you are here. Please do drop questions into the comments for us, and we will do our best to have Scott answer them as we go along. We will keep an eye on those questions, so don't hesitate to interact with us and make this a dialogue as we go along. Before we dig into the nitty-gritty details of the science, let's start with an easy one, Scott. What is your favorite part of being a scientist?
Man, basically all of it. There's really nothing about my job and my work that I don't really enjoy and love. One of the things that's nice about science is the sort of freedom that you get to study whatever you want. You can pick any aspect of our world and kind of understand it better. And anything that I find fascinating, I can work on. If I decided tomorrow that I was really concerned about microplastics and I wanted to study that for the remainder of my career, I can switch fields and do that. And there's no one that can tell me I can't. And the only thing limiting me is research funding and what my university will allow me to do. And so I have a lot of freedom to study what I want. And what's nice about that is because you're really excited about topics, you get to contribute to this like thrill of discovery that almost all scientists share. We love learning new things about the world and about how it works and how we understand our world. And for me, I do a lot of applied science. I like to take science and use it to help solve problems. So one of the things I love doing is contributing to some of these concerns and issues that we have, trying to understand them better and help us to solve them or prevent them in the future. And so I really like that aspect. More philosophically, I really like to contribute to this human endeavor of trying to understand how the world works and to increase our knowledge of the world. And I think that's a really important aspect of what I do. As an academic scientist, I also get to work with students a lot, and that's a really rewarding and fulfilling experience to see them grow and to help them learn how to, sort of become scientists, but also to sort of join the real world as adults and how that process works and to inspire them to go out and do great things in the world. That's a really amazing feeling and has a lot of impact potentially beyond what I can just do in my lifetime. If you think about the number of students I'll see in the classroom over the years. So I really love that aspect of it as well.
Well, you've touched on so many things there. I love, first of all, when it comes to science, I'm right there with you. I think the opportunity to ask questions and then pursue those answers is something that scientists get to do, and not a lot of other professions do, right? Not a lot of other places do you get to say, well, why is this happening, or what is happening here, and then actually pursue that question.
Right.
So I love that. And is that something that really drew you to want to become a scientist as you were thinking about career paths?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, is the more you learn in science, the more you realize what we don't know, and that's the really amazing. One of the amazing parts about it is how much you realize you know so little about how things work, and as you get more into it, you have more questions, and every study you do produces more questions, and it's a very engaging process, and you really just can't wait to dig in and learn more and more, and it becomes almost like you almost like have to do it, right? Because you're just so interested in trying to learn more and know more.
Absolutely. And to have that process play out for your students firsthand, where they're actually getting to do that, to walk through that together with you and to see it firsthand and to participate in it. I think from an education perspective is just so powerful that instead of just looking at pictures in a book or hearing about the research, they're actually doing that with you. So talk a little bit about how you've done that with your students, and while you do that, I'll go ahead and share this picture that is so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in, doing science in the lab or in the field, from the day that you sort of walk in at Queens, and something that we take pretty seriously at the Sciences at Queens. So we like to go out in the field. We like to have students doing science once they walk right in and join labs and join their classes. And in this picture, we're out at a wetland here in the Charlotte area that's controlled by the Catawba Lands Conservancy, a local nonprofit. And we take students out to this wetland, and it's closed off to the public, so they get to see what this natural system looks like. And we go out there, we look around for interesting little critters, and I can connect this stuff to the work that I do. So in this case, what's really cool about this wetland is there's some interesting questions there about salamanders that live there that we might get to talk about a little bit later. And so we're out there looking for these salamanders. We can give them the opportunity to kick over some rocks and flip over some logs and see what they find. And often when we start dip netting into the wetlands, students will find weird things that they've never seen before. They don't know what they are. And in this example, they'll call me over and they've got something in that dip net there, right? And they're sort of, one of them's pointing at it like, what is this thing, right? And that's just really fun. It's fun for them. And and again, we're not just out there looking around at stuff for the sake of looking at stuff, which would be fun on its own, but there's a sort of reason that we're there, which is contributing to this scientific endeavor, because I'm doing studies and things that are going on out there at this wetland right now. And so it's both getting out and seeing stuff in real life, but also getting to contribute to that scientific endeavor at the same time. And that's a big part of what we do at Queen.
And you used the word discovery earlier too, right? So the idea that and I always love this quote from that's been attributed to Galileo, that you can't really teach anyone anything. You can only help them to discover it for themselves. Right. And what I love about this picture, you can actually see that that's what's happening. Students are discovering for themselves what is happening, and they're asking questions. And I think what we sometimes forget is it seems like we already have all the answers, but the opposite is absolutely true. We don't have all the answers, and there's still a lot about our world and our planet that we don't know. And so to get to do that, and to do that in this kind of group setting with you as the leader, I think is an incredible opportunity for college students to be able to do that.
Yeah, and a big thing of what we do when we do laboratories with our classes is giving students real authentic sort of research experiences, right? So they get to design experiments or get to perform experiments. And I make a big point of telling them that when we're doing these experiments, I don't know what they're gonna find. It's not a typical lab like you might do in high school or something like that, where you add a thing to a thing and it turns blue and that means you have sucrose in your sample or whatever, right? Like I tell them that they're manipulating things and doing things, and I don't know what the answer is going to be, and they don't know. And that's a really empowering thing, to know that you're doing something that feels very authentic and very real.
It builds drama in the classroom too, right? Something about when the teacher doesn't know what's going to happen, that really gets students excited to say, oh, wait, you don't know what's going to happen? Oh, this is really going to be fun.
Exactly, yeah. And confidence as well. Like it can fail, and that's okay, right? And sort of learning that process as well.
Absolutely. So let's dig into the research a little bit. What is the focus of your research that you do with Queen's University?
So I'm an ecotoxicologist. That means that I study the effects of chemicals on the environment and on living organisms specifically. I'm really interested in the effects of the chemicals that we release into the environment, either on accident or on purpose in some cases, and what sort of potential negative effects that's having or not having in the best case scenario. I'm really focused on amphibians and reptiles. Those are organisms that I found really fascinating when I was going through a biology degree during my undergraduate experience. And they're also not studied very often when it comes to chemical contamination. So it was a perfect sort of marriage of two topics that I was really interested in, understanding pollution and chemical contamination and effects on these weird organisms that a lot of people don't study very often, that I think are really fascinating. And a big part of what I do is something called ecological risk assessment. And this is a process, a sort of mathematical process that we use to quantify or determine how likely something negative is going to happen from a chemical contamination in the environment. And that's become a big part of what I do, and especially the last 7 or 8 years of my research. Risk assessment's been a big part of what my interests are, and usually focused on amphibians and reptiles, but I've done lots of other organisms as well, which we might talk a little bit about today, birds and aquatic invertebrates and things like that as well.
You talked about how reptiles and amphibians were really interesting to you as an undergraduate, and it sounds like the work that you do now has kind of come together over many years, right? So how is that focus for your research? How has that gone? How has it shifted, or how has it grown as you've started to really dig into the science?
Yeah, it's shifted quite a bit actually. When I was an undergrad, I just loved amphibians and reptiles. I just wanted to be an amphibian reptile biologist, and there's a term for that called herpetology. I wanted to be a herpetologist. And as I was looking into graduate programs, I started reading scientific papers, and I came across one that used amphibians as bioindicators of contamination in the environment. And I thought that was really fascinating. I've always been interested in pollution. I've always been interested in chemical contamination, and the thought of putting those two things together really fascinated me. But what's interesting is I wanted to study amphibians, so I went and did a master's degree and studied amphibians. During my PhD, I switched to reptiles because that was what I was doing at the time, what I was interested in at the time. And then I did something called a postdoctoral position, which happens after your PhD. And I went back to amphibians again. And I've sort of switched back and forth throughout my career, just as, sort of topics that were interesting to me, topics that came up, and just based on my local surroundings and what was going on in that environment that I was in, but allowed me to answer questions that were interesting at the time. And so I have jumped back and forth quite a bit. And at this point, I've done a lot of amphibian work. I'm doing a lot of amphibian work in the lab right now, but I've also done a lot of reptile work as well. So I've switched back and forth quite a bit.
And it sounds like a lot of that switching happens for a couple of reasons, right? One is your interest may change over time, but then the other piece is questions may emerge, right? As your research goes forward, there might be questions that you may not have thought of before that suddenly emerge and become interesting along the way. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, your interests change, things come up. Sometimes things are out of your control. When I started my PhD, I was at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, and I wanted to do amphibian work, and they have these really interesting wetlands there with lots of amphibians in them. And so I developed an entire proposal around amphibians and the agricultural pesticides that they use and all these different things. And then it didn't rain for 19 months straight.
Oh.
And as we kept waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for it to rain, eventually my PhD advisor said, you have to consider another option. You might have to do something else. And something came up and allowed me to transition to doing reptiles and really focusing on that. And so sometimes things are just out of your hands as well. So there's a chance component to it. There's a question, there's a problem, concern component to it. So yeah, it's a very fluid thing that happens when you're doing research. You sometimes have to pivot.
Yeah, so I was actually just going to stop and remind folks on our Facebook feed to make sure that you're putting in your questions for Scott so that he can answer them. And it looks like we've got one that came through. What do you hope to change with your research? And what do you hope to accomplish or change with your research?
Yeah, so ideally, I think people who do applied work, who want to do research that's going to help solve a problem or help address the problem that's occurring. That's our highest goal, right? Is to really sort of address that problem or to prevent it from happening in the future. So I'm always hoping that my work will be useful to people who are trying to directly address an issue, whether it's a conservation concern, whether it's a chemical contamination concern, what have you, an endangered species concern, something along those lines. I'm hoping that the work I do is useful to someone and that it will help to solve that problem or prevent that problem in the future. In my case specifically, because I work a lot with chemicals, pesticides, things like that, I always hope that my work will influence policy and regulation in some way. If I find something that seems problematic, I hope that my work will contribute to regulatory requirements that say maybe we shouldn't use that pesticide anymore if it's causing a lot of problems. Or alternatively, if my research shows that the pesticide's not causing a problem, it helps regulators understand that maybe that's not something that we need to focus on right now. So ultimately, I'm hoping that it will help solve problems or to show that things aren't as much of a problem as we thought and that it's not something that we need to worry about because we have limited funds and limited time to address different concerns that are out there. So ultimately, I like to have an effect on the sort of real world where these things are the science meets the actual, conservation efforts.
Yeah, I think you're starting to touch on this, but I want to dig into this a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is actually share another picture because I really want us to probe this question with you. If I don't live near a pond And if I don't live near a lake or a river or a creek, why should I care about frogs and salamanders? Why should I care about amphibians?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important question because as a scientist, if you can't answer that question to any sort of person you meet on the street who asks you that question, then you've got a real problem, right? If you can't explain why your work is important, and a lot of us get funding from federal government, state government, so taxpayers pay our, our funding for many cases, and so you have to be able to explain to people why your work is important and why it matters. In the case of amphibians, there's a lot of answers to this question. A big one that's very specific to sort of why should I care as a person who is alive in this world. Why, when we think about amphibians, a lot of them eat little bugs or little invertebrates, things like that. A lot of amphibians help to control some pests. So if when you think about mosquito larvae that live in ponds or wetlands, tadpoles and some salamander larvae actually feed on those mosquito larvae and help to control those populations a little bit. So they provide some natural pest control aspects to what they do just from being alive and being out there. So even if you don't live next to a pond or a river, having a natural environment that helps to sort of control pests is a really positive thing that these organisms do. We can get a little bit more scientific and esoteric and talk about things that are more related to ecology, and that's how organisms interact in their environment. And in the case of salamanders and amphibians, we can think about how energy, and I mean chemical energy, which originates with the sun and moves through our food chains. Amphibians and salamanders have a really important role in linking wetlands and ponds and lakes and rivers to the terrestrial environment with the energy that they bring in and take out as they move back and forth throughout their lifetime. And they can actually have a really significant impact on that energy, which is a really important role they play. So again, even if you don't live right next to it, that's a big part of how our ecosystems function and work normally, and they contribute to that process as well. So they have a very important ecosystem function. And the last thing I would say is, from a philosophical perspective, there are people who would argue that the natural world has its own inherent value and that we should sort of respect and value that as well. So we think about just the love of diversity and the love of having lots of different organisms out there doing what they do has its own value as well that we should consider.
As we were talking about the little guy, I went ahead and pulled this guy up. Talk to us about what this is and where you found him.
So yeah, so that's a marbled salamander, and they all have that sort of pretty white patterning on their backs there. This is a picture also taken at Whitehall Nature Preserve here in Charlotte. And this is part of a project that we're doing, trying to understand what's going on with salamanders at this site. So this site used to have two salamander species, the one you can see here, the marbled salamander, and another called a spotted salamander. And for a long time, no one has seen a spotted salamander out at this wetland. And the Catawba Lands Conservancy is curious if they're there still or not. And ultimately, of course, if they're not there, why are they not there? And what caused them to not be there anymore? And so what we have started is a project that began in a classroom last fall with students of mine. Madison Jays and Ashley Fitch started this project where they put down a bunch of cover boards to look for these salamanders at this wetland. And I've continued that work through this past semester. And so far, all we've seen are these guys, these marbled salamanders under these cover boards or in the area, and no evidence so far of any spotted salamanders, unfortunately, which might mean that they're no longer present. We have to do maybe another year or two of monitoring to make sure that that's true. But so far, the evidence doesn't look great. And so we both know that marbled seem to be the dominant presence there. And so now the question is sort of why, and why did that happen? And what was the cause? And that will be sort of the next steps once we sort of establish that this is the case.
Well, and what's interesting too about what you're saying is that the role that these animals have in our ecosystem, we're not talking about an ecosystem that's far away. We're talking about the Charlotte region. We're talking about the work that you're doing is really digging into these animals that they're around, they're everywhere, but they're very shy, right? So from a museum perspective, we know that one of the things that's challenging with salamanders is to display them for the public because they do want to be under logs and under rocks and under boards. Mm-hmm. And so how you display them in a tank in a museum is actually one that our life care team has to think through pretty significantly to say, how do we actually let people see this? So talk a little bit about how you have found this little guy around and how other people may be able to find a salamander in their backyard or in a park or nearby, or when they're out hiking. What is there? How could we get them to show themselves, if you will, so that we know that they're there? And we can recognize them and celebrate them.
So the way to sort of look for these kinds of salamanders and salamanders in general is you want to be looking under substrates that kind of hold moisture a little bit. So you can flip over kind of rocks, relatively large rocks, relatively large logs, especially if they're sort of a little bit rotting. So they've got a nice community of insects and invertebrates under there for them to feed on. So if you walk around, if you're hiking on a trail or something like that, you can always pick up these logs and sort of just like lift them up carefully. Be real careful about where you're putting your hands, but if you do it safely, you can sort of lift the log up a little bit and see what's kind of under there and hanging out. And that's where you'll likely find these guys. My class, my freshman biology class, was out at Discovery Place Nature this spring, and we were out on a day that was kind of rainy and drizzly, and they were walking around looking for different organisms, and I happened to just go right off the trail about a foot and flipped over a log, and there was a salamander under there, and everybody got real excited. Everybody's taking pictures of it. So they're out there. You just kind of have to look for them and get used to the right size log that has the right amount of sort of rottingness to it. We start to develop a sort of search image. We can figure out what looks good. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at that. And you'll be able to find the right logs and the right size and the right location. You'll start to get really good at it. And they're out there. You just got to look for them.
That's great. Thank you for that. I'm going to actually stick with this local theme because we do have a question that's come in through Facebook, which is how has your work contributed to any policy changes locally? As you've shared the outcome of your work, has that made what impact has that had locally?
So locally, not a whole lot yet. We might talk in just a moment about some of the work that I've been doing the last couple of years, looking at rodenticides. We'll talk about that shortly. But locally, I haven't had a huge impact necessarily on policy, but I have had an effect somewhat on policy internationally. So I was a member of a working group for the European Food Safety Authority, which is called EFSA. And EFSA is a European Union body that is kind of like the EPA and the Food and Drug Administration sort of rolled into one sort of for the European Union. And they cover a lot of agriculture, food creation, pesticide uses, et cetera. And they did a special working group trying to understand how to incorporate amphibians and reptiles into the risk assessment system, which currently doesn't happen. And this working group needed somebody who was a reptile expert, reptile ecotoxicology expert. And there are very, very few of us. There's maybe a handful of us or less that do this kind of work. And I was asked to be a member of that working group and provide that expertise. And our final product was a scientific opinion document that would then form the basis for changes to EFSA policy in the European Union in the future, and maybe requiring that pesticide companies start to explicitly consider amphibians and reptiles in their risk assessment process when they're trying to understand the potential risks of using that chemical. So there are some very direct impacts that some of the work that I've done has had. Not as much locally here in North Carolina, but I've also haven't been here that long yet. It's only been about 5 years. So give me a little bit of time.
That's right. So must have been rewarding, right? That's very meaningful to say my work, my input to create policy that is going to have the impact that you hope that it would be. That must be a very rewarding part of your work to be able to make that, have that impact at that level. Yeah,
it's really just sort of amazing sometimes, you know, like just even being over in Europe and being asked to be there and flying back and forth all the time and also doing my classes. It was really chaotic, but it was also just sort of felt very amazing just to even be there and to be recognized for that expertise, because you never think that that's really going to happen until it sort of does. And then it's just, wow, I actually maybe have accomplished something with all this work that I've been doing for the last decade or so, right? And that's a really great feeling to be recognized for that work.
Absolutely. So you teased it earlier. So let's go back to that, to this question about what is something that you've uncovered in North Carolina that you wish, or in South Carolina that you wish Carolinians would know about?
Yeah, so I've been doing some work the last few years on raptors, so owls and hawks, vultures, organisms like that, and looking at contaminants in these birds. And I have a collaboration with the Carolina Raptor Center, just in the north side of Charlotte, out by Lotta Nature Preserve. And we have a collaboration where we can sometimes get some of the birds that are not able to survive from the Raptor Center. They give them to us and we're able to harvest samples from them. And we did a study, we got some funding, applied for some research funding to look at rodenticides, which are a type of pesticide that kills rodents, you might imagine. We also looked at mercury as well. But what we found with the rodenticides was that a lot of these birds, a surprising number, I think it was about 30% for some of the species, had levels of rodenticides in them that actually exceed levels that are known to cause significant harm to birds. And the Raptor Centers also had a few incidences of birds that came in with anticoagulant rodenticide poisoning. Like they know that that was the case because of the different symptoms that the birds had. So these birds are getting exposed to these rodenticides, and in some cases, the levels are high enough to be a cause of concern. And it's becoming a bigger issue nationwide, internationally actually, looking at these rodenticides and the effects they're having on raptors and any mammals that also feed pretty heavily on rodents. And it's becoming a topic that people are talking about more and more.
That's fantastic. I did want to share one of our pictures that we have as well of the work that you're doing along these lines, where your students are, again, getting to be hands-on and getting to see this firsthand. So let me pull that picture up and then talk about what's happening here.
Yeah, so this is another sort of classroom experience where students are working on these projects that are a part of my own research efforts. So this was a senior level class, a capstone class, and the students were all doing projects that were contributing to work that we were doing with the Raptor Center. And so in this picture, we're doing what's called a necropsy, which is a sort of dissection of a deceased individual. And so these birds were not harmed or hurt for this research that we were doing. They were already not able to make it at the Raptor Center. And so we get these birds in and we're able to use them in class or use them for our research. So in this case, we're sort of opening these birds up and showing students what, what it's like looking around in there, pointing out the different tissues, and then harvesting some of those tissues that we then use for analysis, like liver, for example, is a really important tissue for chemical analysis. So we're taking livers, we're taking their stomach contents, their gastrointestinal systems. Sometimes we're taking things like feathers as well. So getting a lot of tissues that we can use for analysis. And it's really hard to get raptor tissue, actually. They're protected, most of these species are protected under regulation. So it's really hard to get samples. And that's what made our project kind of unique, is that we had this access to samples that were relatively easy for us to get. And so we were able to analyze them and see what's out there. And that's not always easy to do. So it's really exciting for them. They get to have this really cool experience of opening up these birds and seeing what's going on in there. But then we also get to do the analysis and see what those results look like as well. So really exciting. And again, another way that I like to try to inject what I do into the classroom.
Yeah, this looks like an incredible opportunity for these students to be able to do this firsthand, and it's probably one that will inspire them to want to continue to do that. So let me back up here, because we've got a couple of questions that have come in on Facebook. For those of us who don't have access to those types of experiences, if you're not a scientist, how can someone learn more about using science in their day-to-day life?
It's a really good question, actually, and I gotta say, if you're alive now, the opportunities that are available to you are so much better than when I was a kid, right? Like if I wanted to go look for organisms or whatever, I sort of had to, kind of have a book or have somebody explain it to me, or, I had to be just curious enough to be going around and kicking over logs and things. But now the apps and things that you can get on your phone are really sophisticated and really good. And so something like iNaturalist is a great example. You can use iNaturalist to try to help you identify things that you see when you go on a walk in your neighborhood. You can also look up places where people have found critters nearby, and you can also go and look and see if you can find things there. So if somebody posts that they saw a salamander or a skink or something like that nearby, you can go to those places and see if you can also try to find them. It can really help you narrow down where to look, and it can also help you if you find something, take a picture of it, put it on the app, and somebody can help you identify what that thing is, even if you don't have a natural history guide or something like that, a field guide to help you figure those things out. So the things that are available on apps on phones and with Google is really incredible. And so I'd recommend looking at some of those apps like iNaturalist and some of those that you can download that help you identify plants, identify animals. You can use that for quite a bit, and it can really help you explore your world in a very significant way.
What I love about iNaturalist too is that not only am I contributing to my own learning, but I'm also contributing to it can go through a verification process where it can also be used by scientists as they're tracking animals and animal populations. And so you're actually contributing to that research so you benefit from learning, but you're also contributing to the scientific enterprise, which is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, citizen science is a really big topic right now, trying to get people to contribute to this scientific endeavor. And I've got colleagues that work at different institutions that use citizen science as part of their data collection. A good friend of mine actually uses telemetry and GPS sort of picture data to try to count the penguins that are like inhabiting Antarctica. And she has this website where you can go and you can actually help them count the number of penguins in the pictures. And they teach you how to identify what a penguin looks like, how to learn what a penguin looks like in the pictures. And then you can go through and you can count. And again, it goes through a verification process. Multiple people look at each picture, but when you go in and you actually count those penguins, you're actually contributing to that data collection. You're actually helping to quantify and to track those populations through time. So you're contributing to conservation by just going online and, you know, counting penguins on pictures. And that's fun. I mean, it's a fun thing to do, actually.
It is, and it has an impact, right? And you know that you're contributing to the endeavor. And so I see that we have a question from Michelle, which I think Michelle, we definitely encourage you to use iNaturalist and other apps to answer this question, but we can definitely look at this as well. So what's the difference between a salamander and a skink? We have something in our yard that my son thinks is a blue-tailed skink. Are they common in Charlotte?
Yeah, so good question, and a common error that sometimes people make, even some of my students sometimes when they first come into class, is being confused about a salamander versus a skink, because they kind of look similar. You know, they have this like elongated body, a tail, four limbs. They have a similar body shape. A salamander is an amphibian, which means that they need water, or they require a bit more reliance on water than a reptile does. And most amphibians also have to go back to water to lay eggs. So a salamander has to do that. A skink is a reptile. It's a lizard, a type of a lizard. And so they're not in the same biological group. And reptiles are not as reliant on water. Most reptiles lay eggs on land, and a skink is the same way. And so they don't have to go back to the water to lay eggs. Their skin is a little bit less permeable. Reptile skin's actually just like our skin. The same layers that our skin has, reptile skin has as well. And whereas amphibians have a little bit different and a little bit thinner skin. So they are in two very different groups. That blue-tailed organism that you saw probably was a skink. I believe your son is correct. Skinks, especially young skinks, baby skinks, often have a really long, bright blue tail. And that's to make predators focus on the tail instead of the body. And the predators will attack the tail because it's brightly colored and sort of moving around. And that will actually help protect the skink from being eaten. The predator will go after the tail can come off, and the skink can run away, and the predator gets the tail, but not the whole organism. And that's a defense mechanism that they have, but they usually lose that when they get older. But if you see, and they're very common, if you see something that looks like a salamander or a skink, if it's got a bright red head and it's a relatively big organism, that's a skink too. That's called a broad-headed skink, and that's not a salamander. That's definitely a reptile lizard.
And most of the time, just in terms of behavior, you probably won't see a salamander running across your porch or running through. That's probably not going to be something you're going to see a salamander do. They really are kind of reticent and stay back and under the logs and not running across your porch.
That's very true. Yeah, unless you live right by a creek or something like that, and you've got a pond or something, and you've got a lot of logs and things for cover. Yeah, you're not likely to see a lot of salamanders. They're pretty cryptic is the word that we use, meaning that they like to hide. They like to stay hidden. So they're not always easy to see. And yes, you're more likely definitely to see a lizard or a frog than a salamander for sure.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit because I also want to be mindful of time. And so let's shift and talk about what we think that we're seeing. So I keep hearing these stories of nature and natural environments healing. Right, they're healing during this time as we have quarantined and humans have withdrawn from some of these natural environments. What are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on this concept that we might be healing or undoing hundreds of years of damage that we have done before? Is this real? Is this really happening in a couple of months? And what lessons can we take from it?
Yeah, it's a really, I think, important question now. Ironically, just this morning, a colleague sent me an article that came out. And they have a term for this phenomenon that you're describing, and they call it the anthropause, meaning that anthrop meaning human and pause meaning we put a pause on some of our activities. And what's interesting is I think it's important to point out that we don't know yet for sure that some of these, how big of an effect does the anthropause really have? I mean, it just started happening, so we don't have data yet. But I suspect, and what I've seen so far in terms of data has been very preliminary. Things like air pollution levels in March versus March of 2018 or 2019, for example. Very, very preliminary stuff. But some of those things that I have seen look pretty significant. And, if it turns out that there really is an effect of this anthropause on our world in terms of environmental health, in terms of animals and their behaviors, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And I think sadly that there's a point to be taken here. I think that there is a point about this shows us if there is an effect of us going on lockdown and quarantining, that shows us that our normal activities have an effect, in some cases, maybe a negative one. And so that does sort of call into question, I think, some of the assumptions or the ethical values that we might have been living under without even necessarily knowing it, And I think, is, I think in some ways economic gain is something that we focus on a lot, and is that something that we should continue to do? And is that where our values lie, or should we try to start balancing things like economic gain with the health of our community, the health of our environment? I think these are really big questions that people are starting to think about and to try to answer.
Absolutely. And we have to think about those things as we're part of the system, right? Humans, we sometimes forget humans are part of that system, that ecosystem, that the salamanders and the frogs help to keep in balance, and the competition between organisms, and we're part of that system. And so what is our role? And when we retreat, right, we pull back, that has an impact, that opens up things, or that reduces the stress on resources. And so those are things that this is an interesting kind of glimpse into that. I had not heard the term anthropause. That's interesting. I've not heard that one before.
Yeah.
But it is kind of interesting to think about. Humans are pausing ourselves and the impact that we have to some extent. Let's be real. We're not completely pausing, but it is interesting to think about how other animals and living things may be affected by the fact that we have withdrawn a little bit and taken a pause.
Yeah.
So as we reboot the world, and we're not there yet, we're still more during COVID than post-COVID, so we're still working through this. But as we start to plan ahead and look at what are the lessons that we have learned, what would you encourage us to be thinking about with respect to those relationships with the ecosystems in which we exist, especially the Charlotte region? We want to think locally, obviously, but in the Charlotte region and then beyond.
Yeah, I think there's sort of the short term and there's sort of the long term, right? Like the immediate sort of questions are important ones in terms of if we're going to reopen and sort of go back to quote unquote normal, whatever normal becomes in the near future. If that's absolutely necessary. And again, when I talk about economic gain as our primary goal, I'm not insensitive to the fact that some people are under some very significant economic hardships, and that's a very real concern and a very real issue that we have to address. So if it is absolutely necessary that we reopen, then I think it's all the more important to be doing it under the best data that we have, the best science that we have at the moment, and that we're following, sort of the recommendations and the suggestions that experts in the fields are telling us to do, and that we are careful about it and making sure that people are protected and trying to accomplish both of those things at once. And again, that comes back to my bigger point, which is thinking about our value system and how do we balance economic gain with both the human health when it comes directly to COVID, but also environmental health as well. Do we want to go back to what was normal before? Do we want to go back to that entirely or not? If the answer to that question is no, this is the time to start thinking about how to do that in a way that was different than what we did before. And just, as a small example, maybe it means that people do work from home more often and don't have to drive to work and don't have to commute and do a little bit less gas. That can have you scale that up beyond Charlotte to the United States to the world. That could be a pretty significant impact and just a relatively small change to our lives. And so we have to start thinking about what are we going to do in the future and how are we going to address that relationship that we have both with ourselves, our community, but also our environment. And I think that this crisis is really making people reflect on that and think about that. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's time to start thinking about those relationships.
Well, and thinking about this as an opportunity, right? As an opportunity for us to think about that triple bottom line, as people call it.
Oh, Gabor, are you there?
Hey, Scott, it does seem like we might be having some technical difficulties with Explore More Me at Discovery Place Science. Hi, everyone. This is Heather Norton. I'm coming to you from Discovery Place Nature. I was in the background, but Scott, I think you were just kind of sharing your thoughts on, how COVID-19 is really changing how we as a society work together and work within our environments. So I don't know if Gabor was able to finish his thought, but I don't know if you have any final thoughts on what you were kind of saying there at the end.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's just a time to reflect and think about values and morals and what we value as a people and as a society. I think that's really this is an important time to start thinking about that. And I think what Gabor was about to say is that this is kind of the opportunity to do that as well, as we have significantly shifted the way we normally function. And it gives us a chance to see that it might not be as hard as we think to make these big shifts and to do these things that we would need to do in order to make a significant impact on our relationship with the planet and with our environment. So I think that this is the time to think about it. I'll say this too, it's since we lost Gabor, we can also sort of open it up to questions too. If people want to ask questions, if people are on and something that they want to know about, anything about science or about what I do, they can feel free to ask us. That's totally fine too.
Just going to take a moment and look at our Facebook page and see if there are any other questions for us. One thing that's so fascinating to me about your background, Scott, is how you have a deep passion for amphibians and reptiles, and yet you did that stint working with birds. And I love birds, and so I just find it fascinating how your interests can just place you in all these very interesting situations to explore science. So
yeah, I'll say it's funny when I talk about that research that I did, people will say, well, oh, you're an amphibian reptile person, like, why are you working on birds? And the easy answer is birds are actually reptiles technically. If we want to get real technical, birds came from dinosaurs are reptiles, therefore birds are reptiles. But technically I'm still in the reptile world. But generally those two groups are sort of bird people are bird people, reptile and amphibian people are reptile and amphibian people. But again, it sort of comes back to the problems at hand and the issues at hand. I had done a little work previously with rodenticides and a little bit with birds as well. And I knew that was a big issue, and it just seemed like a great opportunity. The Raptor Center is here. Not a lot of people in the Southeast are working on this. So I have a nice local connection that is really needed and important. And it just seemed like a great chance to try something different. And one of my colleagues in the biology department, Jeff Thomas, is a bird behavioral evolutionary kind of guy. And so he's got that expertise that allowed us to get together and make that happen.
I don't know if you can tell, but since I wasn't going to be on camera, I'm wearing my mask, but my mask does have birds on it because I am a tad bit of a bird nerd. And so I do love that. I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I don't know if you have any final thoughts. It looks like here we got one. So this is from Lee. And Lee said, if I wanted to pursue a career in herpetology, where should I start? Are there good colleges in North Carolina with herp programs?
Oh, wow. Great question. Hey, Lee, thank you very much for that question. Man, never thought I'd get a question like this. This is super exciting. So yeah, there's the way, if you were interested in amphibians and reptiles, yeah, you would want to go to a program that's got folks that are working in that field. So it's not so much that there's necessarily a good program specifically, but at different universities, you want to look for folks like me that are studying amphibians and reptiles specifically. And you can see that on our web pages and things when you're looking at schools to try and decide where to go, or if you're asking on your kids' behalf where they want to go. And if you look in the biology department, you can see kind of the expertise that people have. You might also look for departments that are sort of wildlife focused or natural resource focused. So sometimes they'll have people that are sort of focused on particular groups of organisms and working in the conservation of that field. Chances are you'd probably also want to consider going to graduate school and getting at least a master's and potentially even maybe a PhD. But there's quite a few jobs out there actually on these topics. You can work for nonprofits. I know someone that runs a nonprofit called the Turtle Survival Alliance, and he works on conservation of turtles, both in the United States and internationally. We have friends that work in academia, in government, who work for private sector. There's lots of things that you can do. You can work in a zoo, places like that. So there's lots of ways to contribute to the conservation of these organisms. Ultimately, you want to start getting some research experience. So, getting out there and starting to look for these things, downloading iNaturalist and looking to see where people have found some of these things is a really good idea. You can actually start to look at, what kind of organisms do you really find fascinating? Most people sort of focus on one thing. I've jumped around a lot because I'm kind of frenetic in my research interests, but a lot of people are really focused on amphibians and toads and frogs, or some people are really focused on lizards, or some people really love snakes. And so as you start to look at some of these things, you'll start to find the ones that really fascinate you the most, and that will help to kind of focus where it is that you want to start studying. And as you get into your undergraduate degree, at some point you'll start reading scientific papers that people publish in journals. And those are not usually super fun to read. So you know that you're excited about a topic when you read a scientific paper and you can't wait to read another one and you want to actually go read more about it. That's when you know you're really excited about that topic. And that was how I knew for me. I was reading scientific papers and I just loved these papers where they were looking at pollution and amphibians and just the connection there and the fact that they might be kind of sensitive. That just really blew my mind. I just couldn't wait to read more and more and more. And that really launched me into my career and where I am now. So that's the sort of process, is start going around and looking around. That's how a lot of herpetologists started out. They just loved picking over rocks and logs and finding, little critters. That's how many of us started. And start looking at programs and find people who are working on amphibians and reptiles. And in North Carolina, there's quite a few, actually. You'd be surprised. A lot of the schools have folks that work on amphibians and reptiles. And what I will say is, especially if you're in the Charlotte area, one big program that you might want to look at is the Savannah River Ecology Lab, which is actually in South Carolina, in Aiken. A lot of folks there that do amphibian reptile work as well. So there's a lot of places out there, and if you start looking around, you'll see that there's quite a few of us that are interested in these organisms. And Queens actually just hired a new biology person who's an ecologist, and she studies salamanders as well. So I now have a sort of comrade in arms, as it were. We're going to do some cool work in the future, I hope. So when you start looking around, you'll see lots of schools have folks that are studying these issues. So but look in the biology departments and you'll find people who are looking at these things.
So I see Gabor is able to join us, so I'm going to now close my camera back off and let you two take it over. So thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Heather. Good catch.
Thank you, Heather. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. I'm not able to see I don't see any questions on the chat box. I'm not sure if we have any more questions on Facebook. I think the only question, Scott, that we had left just in closing, we can maybe put this forward, is what is something that you have learned through your many years of science and many years of inquiry that you wish that you would want to share with others, that maybe others have not had a chance to see that glimpse into all of those things, and you would want to share with us?
Yeah, I think it's it's an interesting one. There's a lot of things I could do here. I will say, in our world of Zoom meetings and Skyping and things now, it's like I think we've all had an experience where somebody dropped or did something. It happens all the time.
Disappeared from 1 minute to the next. Yeah,
right, exactly. It's the new normal, I think. So one of the things that I thought was really fascinating that I've learned throughout my process of becoming a scientist and going through graduate school is how science advances. I think a lot of people think that somebody does a study and they figure out a thing and now everyone knows that thing, right? Like that's how some people think that science works. And really, it's this very slow process of the accrual of information, right? Like I do a study and it finds one thing, somebody else does a study and agrees, and somebody else does a study and it agrees, and over time, the knowledge builds up and we converge on agreement and consensus. And I think that's why folks are sometimes confused about why are some topics debatable and some are not debatable. Why can we not, why are climate change deniers a bad thing, right? Necessarily, or not necessarily. And I think what that comes down to this understanding of how science works. At the beginning, when we just are learning about something, we don't know yet, and people are accruing knowledge and building up the knowledge so that we can get to the point where we understand it. So when we think about something like COVID, it seems like every day there's new information that might contradict old information or might expand old information. And it can be kind of confusing, but that's the time that we're in. It's very new. Everybody's learning about it and we're getting all this new information. So we're not at the point yet where we have consensus and we know how things work yet. But when we think about something like climate change or something like evolution or something like the existence of DNA, for example, we have established that and we feel confident about it because it's been found over and over and over again. That doesn't mean that it's not questionable. If somebody comes up with scientific data that seems to call it into question, then we're always open to that interpretation. But once things seem pretty solid, unless somebody comes up with a much better way of explaining how those things work, we stick with that plan and we move on to other things that seem like they need more important work. And so what that sometimes does, that slow accrual of knowledge, sometimes it sort of forces you to kind of rethink about your own perceptions and your own ideas on these topics. Just as a personal example, I'll tell you a little bit about my journey. As a simple example, I don't really like to fly. I kind of have a fear of heights. It's a phobia, really, and it's a phobia because it's an irrational fear. And I understand that it's an irrational fear. And so I still fly. I don't like the experience, but I still do it because I know the data is so rock solid. Like flying is very, very safe. It's much safer than me getting in my car and driving to campus today, right? Or something like that, right? So I know that, and I'm very confident in that. My brain knows it. My heart or my amygdala or whatever doesn't know it, but my brain, the logical part of my brain knows. And so I'm still able to fly. I still get on the plane and I still know, like, take off, like, oh, it's kind of weird, but I know it's going to be okay, right? And that's like a very simple example. A more scientific one is when I started as an undergraduate thinking about chemicals and pollution, I was kind of this mentality that chemicals are bad, right? Pollution's bad, chemicals are bad, pesticides are bad, they're hurting our environment. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not true. And I've had to sort of really rethink how I feel about these things, that a lot of the time, if a pesticide doesn't seem to be having major problems and is beneficial to us, it helps, increase crop yields and provide food, safety and things like that, that's beneficial. And if something doesn't seem to be having any concerns, then we should be allowed to use it. We should be able to reap the benefits of it. And so I've had to really shift how I feel about that. And part of that's been this process of learning and accruing this knowledge and realizing that my initial perceptions were incorrect. And you sometimes have to rethink how you feel about things, especially when the data is pretty clear. And it's really changed how I feel about chemicals and pesticides in general. Chemicals are just chemicals. And science is the way that we tell whether a chemical is a problem or not a problem. And that doesn't mean that science is perfect or infallible. It's not. It's been misused in many cases, and it can be misused and manipulated. But as a process, it's a very good process for learning how the world works and understanding when a chemical is safe and when it's not, and when we can use it and when we shouldn't. And that's really what gets me going to do the research in the first place, is trying to understand those two things, that dichotomy.
Absolutely. And you and I have talked about this before. This goes back to that idea of the best of what we know today, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of times the best of what we know today is actually, we know a lot because we've done a lot. I usually use the example with my students when I've been an educator is to say, stepping into science is like stepping into a conversation. There's a lot of conversation that has happened before. And when you step into it, you need to try to catch up as much as possible so that you can continue that conversation and add on to that conversation. And I think understanding how far along we are with the conversation, with our knowledge and with what we think that we know, and the best of what we know today is really an important part of saying, well, what is the best of what we know? What do we know? And did that research start 6 months ago, or did it start 200 years ago? And what have we talked about so far, right? And kind of digging. So, but we do have a fun question here from our Facebook friends. What is a cool unknown science fact about one of the animals your research is focused
on? Cool unknown science fact. Interesting. Oh, okay, I got one. So I study amphibians, frogs, salamanders, those kinds of things. If you think about how frogs are portrayed in your normal sort of TV shows, cartoons, etc., right? And when you think about salamanders, which aren't portrayed very often, mostly because we don't see them very often and people aren't that familiar with them, but we think about frogs, they're always shown with these really long tongues that can leap out and grab an insect out of the air or something, right? That's like the common sort of perception of how frogs work. Most frogs don't feed that way. Most frogs actually have a very short tongue, and a lot of them have a flap tongue. It kind of flops open, and they can like grab an insect right in front of them and it flops back in. That's how a lot of frogs and toads and things feed. There are some frogs that have these really long tongues, but it's not ubiquitous, and it's not every frog. Interestingly, many salamanders actually have that long tongue mechanism that shoots out and grabs food. And I think it's interesting that there's like this misconception that all frogs feed that way, and many of them actually don't at all, and many salamanders actually do. And I don't think a lot of people know that. And learning that was really interesting to me too. It's again one of those situations where my perception of the thing was kind of wrong, and I had to fix it and adjust it, right? So yeah.
That's interesting. And we do see frogs everywhere, right? We see them on cereal boxes. We see them on, I think we've seen them on album covers. We've seen them in TV shows and movies and all kinds of places.
Yeah.
And we don't see salamanders. And the frog is not a frog is not a frog. And we haven't even talked about toads, right? So there's so many different directions and characteristics that animals have. And so that's interesting. So the long tongue thing is not for every frog, but it is for the occasional salamander. That's interesting. I did not know that.
Much more common with salamanders than with frogs, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Heather, I don't see any other questions from our Facebook friends. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. Scott, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And I know that you're going to have a huge impact locally, and you're already having a huge impact internationally. So we're grateful for all that you're doing and for your sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for everybody that is watching, and happy to be here. It was a lot of fun. So I appreciate you bringing me on.
Absolutely. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And please continue to send us questions and thoughts. Use the hashtag @MyDiscoveryPlace. And we will see you guys again real soon. Bye.